Do you think history books can ever be neutral?
Academics are supposed to strive for that. That should be the ideal standard. Howard Zinn says, throw away that ideal. All caution to the wind. Be a social justice warrior. Distort the evidence. Who cares? Who cares if you plagiarize, leave out important words, misrepresent people?
Love and light, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of El Podcast, the greatest virtual happy hour in the world. I am your host, Kai Primo, and I am joined by my super co-host, Jesse Wright. If you're new to this channel and you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe and also find the podcast, and all those links will be in the description below. And as always, from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you all for watching and listening, wherever you may be listening from. Our guest today is Dr. Mary Grabar. She is the founder of the Dissident Professor Education Project, a nonprofit dedicated to resisting the re-education of America. Currently, she's a resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. She is also the best-selling author of the book Debunking Howard Zinn, exposing the fake history that turned a generation against America. So today is going to be a very loaded episode. So grab a drink, sit back, and I hope you enjoy the show. Dr. Grabar, thank you so much. We're very, very grateful to have you with us today. Thank you for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I grew up in Boston in the 90s, and I remember finding Howard Zinn's book in 1998 through the movie Good Will Hunting. I remember watching it in a local cinema near MIT where my mom worked. And then later on, my favorite band was Pearl Jam, and they endorsed Zinn by adding their music to the documentary You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. So growing up, kind of post high school, college, I saw him as a hero and my circle saw him as a hero. But now I'm changing my mind. Thank goodness we came across your book. So why did you write the book Debunking Howard Zinn?
All right. Well, that is a long story. I'll try to make it short, but it began around 2008 when I was still teaching. I hadn't been canceled yet from teaching. I was teaching college English, and I was also writing about the corruption in education that I was seeing and trying to expose the public to it. This was before people were so aware and before it had filtered down to the kindergarten level. So I'm talking about corruption in higher education as I see it from within the Ivy walls. I got wind of Howard Zinn, and I thought, oh, I have to write about him. This guy's a big liar. He hates this country, and he's using history, twisting it around to present America in a false light. I did that and wrote a couple articles, and I was invited to present a longer paper to write a report on him. Cliff Kincaid had, in 2010, upon Zinn's death, had made a FOIA request for his FBI files. And Zinn had an FBI file that was over 400 pages long. And so then Cliff Kincaid had a conference, and I attended that, and I presented my 25-page report. I almost got a publishing contract. I can't remember who contacted me or how that came about, but after about 3 months of going through proposal and so forth, it fell through because it was the same publisher that published Howard Zinn's book. So my book was originally going to be titled The Lies of Howard Zinn. So obviously they didn't want a book saying The Lies of Howard Zinn when they're publishing Howard Zinn. And then in 2017, I got a call from the old editor, and I got an agent, and then did get a contract with Regnery. So I've kind of had my eye on Howard Zinn for a long time because I have seen him as a major corrupting influence. He was a very charismatic figure during his lifetime, and his charisma, as many young people can attest, extends into his writing. And of course, our culture has built this kind of celebritydom about him. He is presented as a 1960s justice warrior, right? He's the inspirational figure. And he really was in life a kind of Pied Piper leading students astray, his very own students and other students during protests.
There are more lies in the people's history of the United States than truths. You write in your book, quote, Zinn did everything, misrepresented sources, omitted critical information, falsified evidence, and plagiarized. His rhetorical strategies included leading questions, logical fallacies, and ad hominem attacks. All Americans of goodwill, no matter their political views, should object to such perversion of the truth. What did Howard Zinn actually get correct, if anything, in his famous book?
That's what makes it so believable. The history of the United States, just like the history of any other place, is not perfect. There were abuses. Slaves were abused. Our presidents have not been angels. No one was a saint. But this is the standard Howard Zinn puts up. I mean, there were excesses during World War II, bombing of civilians, and it was horrific. But the way he exaggerates and the way he fails to provide context and manipulates the evidence to do so reveals that this is a false history. It's actually propaganda. It's intended to make readers hate this country, see it as the most evil empire in world history. And he succeeds in doing that. Everything that he sets out to champion, which I would agree with, slavery was not good. Bombing civilians is not good. These sins or flaws in American history, yeah, there is room for criticism of that. But the way he blows those out of proportion, presents them in isolation as if no other country had ever done anything on that scale, makes them unbelievable and false, and is intent, rather than shedding light on a piece of history and exposing it, looking at it from all angles, looking at the nuances. You know, what was someone thinking? What kinds of restrictions did they have? What were the mores of the time? What were the laws? Instead of doing that, as a legitimate historian does, Zinn paints with a broad stroke. It's a Manichaean history, as I say, and others have said. It paints everything in black and white. There are good guys and bad guys, and there's nothing in between. And when I used to teach literature, I would try to expose my students to propagandistic literature, and I try to teach them how to distinguish between something that is legitimate art, literature, and something that is propaganda. And when you have propaganda, you have people who are angelic, flawless, and others who are pure evil. And I did that with a short story by Richard Wright. And in that story, which was written when he was involved with the Communist Party, it was written to Communist Party standards. It showed all communists as being non-racist, as being kind, as being concerned about the poor, and all other people were evil. So that's not the way life is. It's not realistic. Howard Zinn does the same thing. He's not presenting history the way it really was, the way people experienced their lives or tried to do what they could under their own circumstances. It's an attack.
You say in the book that in Marxist theory, the middle class is always the real impediment to a true revolution. Why must the middle class be eliminated for a communist revolution to take place?
Well, you think about it, the middle class is independent. And traditionally in the United States, the middle class seeks to be free of government control. It's the impoverished that are either dependent on charity or on the government. The Marxist wants to eliminate the middle class, and Howard Zinn actually when he talks about the founding, calls the middle class a buffer. They were the buffer between the oppressed and the elites. And the system was set up that way specifically by the elites. The elites just gave the middle class just enough to make them happy and to give them hope for making more. It was all false, according to Howard Zinn. But that was done with the intention of keeping them quiet and suppressing the workers and the lower classes who might want to rise up and rebel and have a revolution. So he presents that as a very clever way to sort of keep the status quo and to keep power in the hands of the rich and the elites.
Let's talk about slavery really quickly. You write in your book that, and I quote, "It was not only African peoples who were enslaved. Slavery was a ubiquitous institution in the early modern period," writes Alan Gallay, "that contemporary to the rise of the African slavery in the Americas, millions of non-African peoples were enslaved. These included over 1 million Europeans in North Africa, and then perhaps more in the Ottoman Empire, as well as the European settlers taken in captivity in the New World by Indians, not to mention the enslavement of Indians by Indians of other tribes. The Civil War not only led to the emancipation of American slaves, but inspired leaders in the slaveholding nations of Cuba and Brazil to take steps to end slavery to avoid a similar outcome," end quote. It seems that many Americans, and I included back in the day, that are unaware that only about 6% of all Africans shipped across the Atlantic were taken in North America. The largest numbers went to Brazil, to the Caribbean. Do you think that Howard Zinn is primarily responsible for this distorted view of history?
Yeah, he was a path breaker. You can pick up any kind of history textbook or standard American history, and you will probably get the impression that most of the slaves went to the North American colonies or the states. But Howard Zinn made that popular. So his book was incredibly popular. It took off. You know, there are over 4 million that have been sold since 1980. And think about how long that this book has been in print. Before the two of you were born, over 43 years ago, it's been in print. You've got multiple generations. You've got parents, maybe even grandparents who grew up with Howard Zinn, and they think this is real history. What Howard Zinn does also is he leaves out a lot of things. He's very slippery in that way. He won't give you the full picture. He'll imply a lot. You feel like you come to your own conclusions, and so you believe that the United States was the greatest slave importer, the most cruel in terms of its treatment of slaves, and so forth. And as a matter of fact, I mention in the book, I was at I think it was an American Historical Association, or OHI, the Organization of Historians of American Historians. I was at a meeting and they had a teacher's workshop on it. One of these teachers who teaches high school, she was very brave because she went against the dominant narrative. She did it with a question. She said, and this one leader, workshop leader, was talking about how to illustrate the cruelty with, how slaves were whipped and so forth, just using emotion. And so this teacher gets up and she says, well, what you just said, only 6% went to North America. She was told, just don't say that. So a lot of these, I sat there and I had to write this down because, of course, this is in a teacher's workshop. They don't think that anyone's there reporting on it. No one else is going to hear this. This is only between teachers and professors. You learn a lot when you go to these things, by the way. And she is told, don't mention that fact. When you're teaching about slavery, don't mention it. And I think there are a lot of teachers and professors out there who do know the truth, but are refusing to teach it.
Who is Howard Zinn? How did he begin this revolution, this ideology that is now and generations long? And I'm seeing its effects on our society today and our government and our education system. Why did he write this book?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Well, Howard Zinn was born in 1922. He died in 2010. He was born into a family of Russian Jewish immigrants who never really achieved middle class status, at least according to his biography. And he grew up during the Depression, the 1930s, which was the heyday of communism. And where he was living was sort of the center of communist recruitment. When he was about 16, he was recruited by these older guys who came into the neighborhood. And he writes in his autobiography that they went on this peaceful march. All these youths went on a peaceful march near Broadway. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these police come by on horseback and they start swinging their batons and beating people up. And he woke up. He came to, I guess he'd been knocked out, and he came to in this doorway and realized that this country was really bad, that capitalism was bad, and that Marx really did have a point. So that was a pivotal moment for him, or at least the way he describes it. I tell a little bit more about those communist marches and, what they really were. But anyway, he then gets involved in communist activities, and he was actually a member of the Communist Party from about 1948 to 1953. Like all communists, he denied it when he was questioned by the FBI. A lot of communists were told to drop their official membership and just work their way into the institutions and try to use their influence and bring the people in there about to the communist way of thinking. And so Howard Zinn went to college. He served in World War II as a bombardier. He came back. He went to graduate school on the GI Bill and wrote a dissertation on Fiorello LaGuardia's congressional career. And then he went to teach at Spelman College in Atlanta, which was a small Christian college for Black women. It was actually started when former slaves wanted to learn how to read. And it was a very religious school. They had mandatory daily chapel attendance, dress codes, curfews. And as you can imagine, so Howard Zinn begins teaching there in 1956. What he does is he indoctrinates the students in his classrooms, and he is an agitator. And he said that he was trying to get them to be activists for civil rights, but what he was really doing was turning them against the administration and skewing their minds to a Marxist outlook. So this college, for the first time, had a Black and a male president. So a Black man was the college president. In 1964, he summarily fired Howard Zinn. So Howard Zinn was going to go up north for a summer vacation with his family, and he gets a note in his mailbox that he checks at the last minute. And there it is, telling him that he will have no more classes. Here's a year's pay and good luck to you. And he was fired for insubordination. There's this whole long sordid story about him claiming that he was wrongfully fired, that he had tenure. And then Albert Manley, who was the college president, threatened him with exposure because there was a morals charge against Howard Zinn. He'd been caught around 10 o'clock at night on a dark street with an underage student sitting in his car. There were all kinds of rumors about him in that respect. And just from talking to people who had known him, he was quite a womanizer. But anyway, he did land at Boston University in about a year. And that's where he worked until 1988 when he retired. And when he was teaching, he didn't really teach. He radicalized students, indoctrinated them, and at Boston University, he led anti-Vietnam War rallies and marches and protests, encouraged students to burn their draft cards and so forth. He was an agitator, not really a professor in any real sense of the term. So that's who he was. He was basically a communist who officially dropped his membership so that he could go and infiltrate education.
Yeah, thank you for that. I heard you in a conference, and you said that all communists in America run the universities. How did the university system in the United States of America get infiltrated with communist ideologies?
Well, it's been a long process. There's something called the Long March through the institutions. So in 1950, you may have had a few people who were communists or communist sympathizers, but eventually they took over the education. They were doing that with labor unions in the 1930s and early 40s. I've seen this happen in academia myself. When I was a graduate student at UGA, University of Georgia, we got a new department chair, and she was a feminist. And people hire people who agree with them. So you hire your own. And eventually it gets to the point where if you have views that are in the slightest way different, you don't get the job. And if you have the job, and if you don't have tenure, you get fired, like I did for speaking out. It shouldn't matter in academia what your political views are, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or a socialist or whatever. If you are doing scholarship, if you are really a historian who is just being honest and wants to look at the evidence as objectively as possible, it shouldn't matter what your political views are. But scholarship itself has become politicized. And that happened in the 1960s. And that happened also as a result of Howard Zinn. He said it's wrong, it's immoral to stand back and be objective as a historian. You have to advocate for social justice. You can't just sit back and try to look at something from all sides. You have to use history to promote an agenda. Well, once you start doing that, you are distorting the evidence. If you want to say your agenda is to present the United States as being the biggest enslaver, the most cruel enslaver, well, you just leave out the other stuff, that 94% of the slaves that had been brought from Africa did not go. So that's what he's done. And they have now taken it over. I mean, you have hiring committees who hire professors. And if you have 5 people on there, maybe one person might be a moderate or conservative, if there is such a thing still in academia. But that person has no influence, right? They're outnumbered. And, and it happens over and over again. I've heard they'll say, well, we need to hire John Smith because he has published 5 books and 100 articles, and he has won these awards. And they may bring him in for an interview and all that, but they'll decide against him. They want Joan Smith, who is a radical Marxist feminist. And that's how it's done. I mean, it's like that in any institution, right? You hire people who agree with you. And academia, ideally, is supposed to be the one refuge where all the ideas play out and people are rewarded for doing honest and thorough scholarship, but it has changed. It no longer is that.
Is wokeism an offshoot of Marxism?
Yeah, wokeism, it's an interesting term. I don't know when it came about. It seems to have come about in the last few years, but it implies that you are alert to injustices, right? And people who aren't woke need to be woken up. You need to be made aware. And so it implies that you're sensitive. It implies a good thing, but it isn't. It is seeing the world through an ideological lens, which is what a Marxist does. A Marxist cannot sort of take the good with the bad with people in terms of evaluating people. People either adhere to the Marxist ideology and they're good, but if they don't, they are bad. And this affects people in terms of their relationships. So you start seeing the world that way through an ideological lens, and your relationships become distorted. You can't have friends who disagree with you. And this happened working on another book about a Black conservative who knew a lot of communists. And he, in one of his columns, written in, I think it's the early 1940s, he talks about this friend that he had, and he ran into her on the street. He had helped her get a job and done all these things for her, but she had joined the Communist Party. And she said, we can no longer be friends. And this is what happens. So woke is, yes, a term that doesn't imply that someone is aware, awake, or anything. But what it means is that they see the world through an ideological lens. They make their decisions that way. And it's a very dangerous way of being because millions have been murdered for ideological reasons and no other.
Marxism, socialism, communism is very popular amongst the youth. In your previous talk, you said that Howard Zinn's purpose in writing a people's history was to make students hate America, right? And convert them to communism, or really shift their ideology, and that they don't question the one side that they're on. And I quote from your book, Debunking Howard Zinn, quote, "A people's history of the United States is intended to inspire anger of such magnitude that its readers want to overthrow the American Republic." So 2 generations later, how effective has Zinn's book been in getting readers to openly accept this ideology, socialism and communism, and especially in the youth today? And also, why is this dangerous? It's a loaded one.
It's dangerous for all the reasons that communism is dangerous. People die under communism, you know. It's produced in the 20th century at least 100 million dead bodies. I talk about being woke and sticking to the ideology. Well, when the leaders decide that the ideology is going to shift and you don't shift along with it, well, there you go. You're on the firing line. They'll shoot you or they'll hang you or whatever, because there can't be any deviations. Howard Zinn's book has had an effect. We can see as his book's sales increased. His book got a slow start in 1980. I think it sold like 4,000 copies initially, which was a small amount, but it kind of had a snowball effect. And what was happening was that leftist ideas were becoming more and more acceptable. So Howard Zinn's book was seen as more acceptable. And that fed on another sort of wave of leftist acceptance. Howard Zinn did this emotionally. He's very good at whipping up people's emotions, presenting victims, using leading questions, presenting himself as this heroic figure. Well, this is dangerous because obviously surveys are showing what you have said you've experienced, with your friends. That shows up in surveys. Now, over half of the younger American population favors socialism over capitalism. Well, they don't know what socialism does in reality. They've never been told that. So that transfers over into the way they vote, right? Every election, it seems like the squad on Capitol Hill, Democratic Socialists, radicals, adds a member. So when you have elected representatives who are socialists, well, they're going to vote for programs that are bringing us to a socialistic state. Very slowly. You're boiling the frog very slowly. People don't know it's happening. And eventually we're going to be losing all of our freedoms. And we're seeing this these days. There are assaults on the First and Second Amendment. It is very dangerous. If Howard Zinn's book had come out in 1950, people would have probably looked at it and said, wait, this is communist propaganda. But after the 60s, I don't think it was as easy to see that because the ground had been sown already with radicalism. So Howard Zinn comes at just the right time. We've had the ferment of the 1960s and the 1970s. These ideas are percolating. There are riots, there are protests, and people during the Vietnam War were marching and seeing Ho Chi Minh as a hero, the communist leader of Vietnam. And here comes Howard Zinn at the right time. So he writes in the late 1970s. It comes out in 1980. And people are nostalgic for those days. And he's got his book. And if you read it, you'll notice some of the language that he uses. He uses the word Negro, which had become unacceptable by 1980, but he's still back in the 60s or in the 50s. He uses things like the system with a capital S or the establishment with a capital E. These are all terms from the 1960s and 70s. And so I think a lot of the people on the left, Reagan's elected. We've gone through the Jimmy Carter presidency. The 1960s have been romanticized. And here comes Howard Zinn with really a 1960s style history, but with a communist message. In that sense, he was an evil genius. He knew how to write a book that would capture the imaginations of readers, especially young people.
Yeah, it also took me by emotion. I think when I read that book long ago, that it was just anger. The first thing I felt was just like, God, this is insane. And I stopped celebrating Christopher Columbus. Do you think that the youth gravitates towards his book? Obviously, because it's so ubiquitous. It's in colleges now, it's in high schools now, because they see so much crony capitalism going on that they're losing hope on the one side because there's so much corruption also on the other side. And they've been taught about victimhood and victimization. And it's like, this is kind of hopeless for us. Well, I'm just going to scream and yell and burn buildings. Do you think that this is kind of where this is percolating from?
Yeah, actually, his book was very popular during Occupy Wall Street. So when they had...
I participated in that, sadly.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, I was teaching during that time. I was living in Atlanta. And in New York City, they have these little libraries set up. And I remember reading articles and seeing videos where people's history was there. It was inspirational. Were you inspired by him to participate?
Yeah, I was since post high school, actually, as a senior in high school. I think early college, and then Occupy Wall Street, just because I lived in Los Angeles and I was around, that was sort of my circle. And, let's go Occupy. And it's like, I never really questioned. It just sounded good. It's a fight for the little people. And that's really mainly what I kind of just look at how I journeyed through that. It sounded great. I want to fight for the small ones. And here I am yelling at banks or i.e. 1%. And I'm yelling at the employees, I was exhausted, and I had no idea why on earth I was yelling and screaming and kicking and camping out in the nasty streets of Los Angeles. After that, actually, after the Occupy movement, I became completely apolitical. I just completely reversed. I just stopped looking at politics altogether. And only now, honestly, in the last year and a half, when we started this podcast, kind of reopening my eyes again, like I mentioned earlier. But yeah, as a younger person back then, the emotions is what got me. It's like, oh my God, murder, all the Native Americans, murder. And yeah, if I could do it over again, but I guess I had to go through that to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what you said, yeah, there is crony capitalism, and it's gotten worse. And that's what radicals do. They latch on to an injustice or a problem in society. But what is the solution to it, right? It's not revolution. It's not because capitalism is corrupt and there's corruption in there. We actually, I think, live under a system of corporatism, which was started in the New Deal. You don't reform it because the revolutionist doesn't believe in reform. And that's what Howard Zinn does, because he says, well, the civil rights movement really didn't do anything. He says, well, before the civil rights movement, blacks could not vote. But then we had the civil rights movement, and then he says, well, the vote doesn't mean anything. When you've got the wealthy and the poor, what does voting matter? So he contradicts himself. But what he presents is this picture where reform is impossible. And that's what was happening during Occupy Wall Street. You get young people who have a lot of energy and who typically are idealistic, and they want to be with their friends, and hey, it's a happening, right? Let's go pitch our tent. I was in Atlanta. I walked through Woodruff Park. People had these tents up and everything. I almost was arrested by mistake because I was trying to follow this crowd and report. I was writing an article, and I had students who were involved in it. But you don't get anything done. So since Occupy Wall Street, there's this Indian, he's from India, I'm trying to remember his name, but he wrote this book and he was working on Wall Street. So what these executives did as a result of Occupy Wall Street is they gave lip service to social justice. And they said, we're going to help the environment. Just get these protesters off our backs. But in the meantime, they've grown bigger and stronger. So Occupy Wall Street has actually exacerbated the problem because it wasn't aimed at reform.
Wow, shocking. I didn't even see it that way.
Yeah, because just think about it. I'm not a business writer, but it would be interesting to see since 2011, how many of these companies have merged? How much more control do they have over our lives? Did Occupy Wall Street do anything to stop that, or did it encourage it? When we look at what corporations are doing in terms of imposing diversity, equity, and whatever it is, DEI, on employees, when you see them taking out these ads for trans rights and everything else, well, that's just using their money to sort of protect themselves from protesters. So people say, oh, wow, Google or Facebook, wow, they're for trans rights. They're righteous. You're not going to go protest them. So they're very clever. And that's protection money. They don't want protesters. So people aren't noticing that anymore. There are no more protests against Bank of America or Coca-Cola or these big corporations because they've decided that, hey, it's worth it to throw a few million here and a few million there and keep the rabble off the streets.
A very cheap loophole that they found. But why do you think the elites then support socialism and want to indoctrinate the youth with this ideology? For example, George Soros and Open Society, he funds a lot of these nonprofit organizations, Black Lives Matter, etc. Wouldn't you think they'd be giving up their control and their riches? Why would a lot of these elites want this to happen?
I mean, it's a racket. That is the big lie of socialism and communism, is that the wealth is going to be divided up and it's going to be given to the proletariat, to the workers. Well, throughout history, even those peasants who received land so they could farm, that was eventually taken back away from them. They would divide up, they would confiscate property, divide it up, give people a few acres, these poor peasants, starving peasants, and then they would come and say, oh, well, we're going to collectivize the farms, we're taking away your property. People get wealthy off of socialism. There is corporate government collusion, and they may be promoting what looks like socialism as an idealist might see it, as spreading the wealth and giving up their profits. But they're not, because they know that the government will give them favors. So what we had during the New Deal was corporatism, where there was collusion between big companies, and only the biggest ones, the little guys, they had the taxes and the regulations, and they were driven out of business. So you had big companies working with the government, which gave them favors. So this is what the George Soroses and the Zuckerbergs and Pierre Omidyar, these billionaires, that's what they're looking for. They are looking for more and more power as they collude with the government. And remember about the middle class. This is intended to drive out the middle class, to eliminate it. So what you will have is some oligarchs and peasants begging for rations. I mean, that is the ultimate goal. That's what they want. They don't want a thriving, free America where people are able to buy a house, raise a family, enjoy their freedoms. They want an America where there are a bunch of dependent serfs and they are the ruling class. And they want people to be dependent on the government. They don't want them to be independent, because if you have the vast majority of your people as independent, then you don't have power over them. That's a threat to your power.
Yeah, that's a really profound message from this podcast. And thank you for answering that, because we're seeing a lot of the liberal cities in the West, the drugs, the fentanyl, the border, and so on, and Antifa was getting out of hand and no one's really doing anything. And behind the scenes, a lot of the billionaires are really funding these organizations. And it's scary. And it seems like not a lot of people are really alarmed by this. It's easy to just pay attention to social media and the current, whatever the new fad is, but this is happening. Like, our cities are turning into Gotham. That might be like doom and gloomy of me, but it's getting worse. And even the harm reduction centers, under the guise of we're helping addicts, they want people to overdose. And people, like, this is how I see it, but this is allowed, and this is inclusive.
Yeah. Are you in Los Angeles? Is that where you live?
No, I moved from Los Angeles, thank God, in 2020. We moved to Puerto Rico. It's just unfathomable. I'm so happy I left, because I had my own business there and I would be homeless myself if I stayed in Los Angeles. But it's interesting that really it's just like where their mindset is. It's psychopathic, and that they do want to see ruined cities, and people are killing each other. People are stealing from one another. Walmart is now out of Portland, the city, because of too many thefts. And I am on a quest for who is creating solutions and who is writing plans to correct this. And do we have a shot? Is there a chance?
I agree with everything Kai is saying, and I've lived a lot longer. And I remember a time when you didn't see any homeless at all on streets. I grew up in Rochester, New York, a middle-sized city. And the closest we had to that was one old lady who was called Garbage Can Annie, and who would go through the garbage cans. One person, and we knew who she was. Now you see tents. As you said, it just gets worse and worse every year.
Early on in chapter 3, you write, Europeans bad, Indians good, which is the overly simplistic view that many people hold. Later in your book, you write, Indians engaged in warfare, kidnapping, torture, slavery, and profit-seeking. Not exactly the idyllic hippie lifestyle Zinn depicts. Since 2018, at least 40 monuments to Christopher Columbus have been removed. Is Zinn's portrayal of Columbus and the Native Americans revisionist history?
Oh, yeah. People who justified defacing Columbus statues and taking them down, the book that is most often cited is Howard Zinn. They believe it, they present it if they go before government meetings, before school boards or whatever, they will quote Howard Zinn. I've seen it so often. A columnist do. They take it as the unvarnished truth. As a matter of fact, in the Washington Post a few days ago, there was this very misleading column, as many of them in the Washington Post are, about these crackdowns in Florida on teaching this false ideological history. It was like 5 things I can no longer teach. And they make it sound as if, okay, we can't teach the truth about how natives were treated. Well, they quote right from Howard Zinn, his opening pages, which were plagiarized, about Columbus coming ashore and being greeted by the Arawaks, which is what he called these Indians, which is not quite accurate, but how they were so gentle, they just swam up to him and brought him gifts, and he in return chopped off hands because they couldn't produce the gold, and raped and pillaged. And so this columnist in the Washington Post quotes this teacher, and she's so upset because under the new laws, she can't teach Howard Zinn. Now, the way she presented it was she can't teach from Columbus's journals. But the students weren't reading from Columbus's journals, because if they'd been reading from the journals, they would have gotten a different picture from what Howard Zinn presents, as he selectively quotes and leaves out important words to make it seem that Columbus was purely motivated by his lust for gold, and that he personally raped and pillaged and stole the land and did everything else. So Howard Zinn, I would say, has the most influence on how Americans see Columbus today.
If they had read the journals, can you give us an example of what they would have read versus what Zinn said in his book?
Columbus was motivated by his faith. Now, he was sincere in this, and he really did like the natives, and he felt that he could convert them and save their souls. His intentions were very good. But Howard Zinn leaves out passages like, I believe we can convert them more by love than by force, and that he told his men never to mistreat them. And he said nice things about them, that they were a gentle people, and that he wanted to convert them by love, not by force. And that is what's left out. And so you have these quotations, and as I point out, you have the ellipses, which you use for maybe a sentence or two, and whole pages are left out. So you get a very distorted picture of what Columbus was saying at that point.
Yeah, gosh, it definitely worked for me. Here in Puerto Rico, there's actually a bronze statue. It's called The Birth of the New World. I think it is an ode to Christopher Columbus landing here. And I believe the Arawaks were actually really the Tainos, who had a neighbor called the Caribs, who were cannibals that they were afraid of. And interestingly enough, we ran to go see that statue just because we were afraid to go take that down. It's larger than the Statue of Liberty right here in Puerto Rico. So
really, wow! If I ever get to Puerto Rico, I'll have to go.
I hope you'd have to go come see it. Yeah, you'd have to come see it.
So, in the book, A People's History of the United States, it seems that Howard Zinn has a really big dislike for the founding fathers as well as Abraham Lincoln. Why do you think that Howard Zinn cannot give Abraham Lincoln credit, who was the first Republican president, for abolishing slavery?
Howard Zinn cannot give credit to anyone in American history. The only people that come off as being good are the victims. And even those people are these anonymous people, often spouting Marxist slogans. But that's the amazing thing about him. If people are assigned Howard Zinn's book, is like, look at the portrayals of every president. It doesn't matter. I have my favorite presidents. I think some presidents were better than others, and there are some that I am very critical of. But I don't, and I don't think anybody else who is honest does a wholesale distortion of them. I mean, he can't find anything good even in Bill Clinton. He couldn't find anything good in Barack Obama even. Anyone who's less than a communist is bad. And even those who are held up as heroes, whether or not you agree with Abraham Lincoln, the man was assassinated for what he did, right? And for his beliefs. You can't give him credit. When I was teaching, I used to teach some of the speeches of Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leader, just to give students an idea of what these people are saying so you can recognize it. So this could be a homework assignment. Go read some of the speeches by Lenin and Stalin and by Earl Browder, some of these American communist leaders, and you will see the same negative drumbeat. Howard Zinn alters it. He makes it sound like a legitimate history, but it's basically the same anti-American Marxist propaganda. If you read Marxist writing and speeches, you will see that the United States is evil. It's an evil capitalist empire through and through. There is nothing good about it. and you can't have anyone, especially a president who's the leader of this country, be good, because Howard Zinn says the country itself is illegitimate. It should not be here. It's something that should be overthrown.
I want to be considerate of your time. Thanks so much. But just this last question. Do you think history books can ever be neutral? Or will it always have a biased component in them, depending on who's writing them and their ideals? And also, there's now 2 generations that have followed Howard Zinn. A lot of these ideals, like I said, like we've talked about, we see today, and it's not looking good for us. How do we start reversing this and having different opinions back into our education system?
Well, the first question is humanly impossible to be totally objective, right? We can't see with the eye of God and see into all truth. But academics are supposed to strive for that. That should be the ideal standard. Howard Zinn says, throw away that ideal. All caution to the wind. Be a social justice warrior, distort the evidence. Who cares? Who cares if you plagiarize, leave out important words, misrepresent people? So we should strive for that. And then I would also say, make a distinction between what you teach a second grader and what you teach a graduate student, right? And so we have this controversy over so-called censorship. Well, a second grader or a 5th grader or a 6th grader does not have the base of knowledge in order to make an evaluation for himself or herself, right? Someone who has had a full, firm grounding in history can look at this skewed portrayal of, say, Abraham Lincoln and say, wait, I know enough about him. This is wrong and this is wrong. Also, when you're teaching younger kids, you don't teach them all the sordid details about a person's life. You don't teach about John F. Kennedy being a womanizer, which he was. We know that, right? I use the analogy of family members. When you're a little kid, you don't learn about if your Uncle Harry had an affair with someone or, they're your heroes. And it's bad for kids to be given this adult information. So if they're just taught that Abraham Lincoln was bad, George Washington was bad, that's who they are because they're Americans. And it affects their self-perception. And just like with parents, kids need to look up to parents and to the adults. It's the same with our leaders. So you don't give the whole full-blown story to a second grader or a 6th grader that you would give to a graduate student. You give them the basics. But what's happening in our schools today is our teachers are pretending that these are graduate students who are taking advanced seminars. And they're going to be learning about things like sexuality and things that subjects that are destructive for young kids. You need to try to be as objective as possible, and you need to teach in an age-appropriate way. So, what's acceptable for a college senior is not acceptable for a second grader.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that. Do you think we have a chance of in our country, or how far along are...
Yeah, I'm glad to see what Governor DeSantis is doing, because back during the time of Occupy Wall Street and before then, even while I was in graduate school, I was trying to expose what was going on. And I would talk to these groups, the Tea Party and other groups, and I'd say, look, let me tell you what's going on here. Sometimes people didn't believe me, but it's like really bad. This is a state university. Call your legislator. Tell him there's this Marxist conference going on and you oppose it. And people were kind of like, yeah, that's really bad, but they weren't energized, and politicians weren't energized. And I think it's just gotten to the breaking point where, Governor DeSantis started it. We've got Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who's now governor of Arkansas, who on her first day signed into law, or I don't know if it was an executive order or she signed into law this bill prohibiting teaching critical race theory. And I think we're going to see more and more politicians who are now awakened to what's going on, woke in that sense, right? They're going to start doing this, and voters have to demand it. Voters in Arkansas voted Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and I think they made a great choice. And she knows what's important, because the future of this country is in future citizens, those kids that are sitting in classrooms.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I know we've taken up a good hour of your time. Would you want to just tell our audience where they might find your work, and we'll link everything in the description?
Yeah, so I have two websites. Most of my articles are posted at marygrabar.com, and it's Grabar. I also, as you mentioned at the beginning, have a nonprofit called Dissident Prof, short for professors, dissidentprof.com. You can get on my email list there. I send out notices when I have something published or if I'm going to be speaking someplace. And it's a great way to stay in touch. Debunking Howard Zinn can be bought any place books are sold. It's published by Regnery. You can find it on their website. I have a link on my websites, and Barnes & Noble, anyplace else. And so I hope people will get it, because some of the things we've discussed here are in that book in detail. And so if you want to fight Howard Zinn in your kid's classroom or your own classroom, when you come across that passage from Columbus's journal, maybe take a look at that. Look at my sources. I encourage people to go back to the original source, and I hope it can be used as a tool to fight the indoctrination that's going on.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Mary Grabar, for joining us. And I hope to have you again on another show. Perhaps if Jesse's up to it, we can talk about debunking the 1619 Project, which is a whole other thing. Thank you once again, and we appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Very special thanks again to Dr. Mary Grabar for joining us today. All her work will be linked in the description below. Please go ahead and find her book. Highly recommend you reading it. And once again, if you're new to the channel and if you like the podcast, please consider subscribing on YouTube. You can also find us on Rumble, and download the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We thank you so humbly for listening to the show. We love bringing great topics. Feel free to comment if there are certain topics that you'd like us to cover or certain authors that you'd like us to invite to the show. And with that, we'll see you on the next episode.